Welcome to the Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. My name is Stephen Van Overmeiren, Chair of the US Accommodations Committee and Associate Director of Global Travel at Baker McKenzie. I'll be your host for today's episode. Today's podcast is the third episode in the Accommodation Committee's Sourcing Podcast series, and we'll discuss the upcoming traditional sourcing season for 2024 hotel contracts, and we'll provide listeners with perspectives and expectations as we head into what's everyone's favorite time of year. Joined today by four great panelists and collaborators. I'm going to have them go around and introduce themselves. And John, maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks, Stephen. It's John Berkley. I'm with Tripbam. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer, and I'm based in the Chicago area. I'll pass it on to Chris.
Hi, everyone. Chris Massucci with Marriott's Global Sales Organization. I'm with the US Canada corporate team with a focus and concentration on the business transient segment. It's great to be here. I pass it on to Lukasz.
Hello, everyone. Lukasz Dabrowski with HRS, in charge in the lead of the global supplier relations. Delighted to be here today. I'm looking forward to the chat.
And last but not least, Iggy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Iggy Fisher. I'm with Club Quarters Hotels as the Assistant Vice President of Sales, mainly covering United States and London, UK. I'm very excited about joining this group for what should be a very great conversation.
Excellent. Thank you all. And thanks again for being here and for joining this podcast. Looking forward to a real lively discussion. Just for the listeners to give a bit of an overview of what we'll cover today. When we talk about expectations for 2024, there are a few key areas we want to cover. Let's talk about volume and the recovery from the pandemic. Let's talk about rates and rate expectations. But let's also talk about some other key trends and priorities that have become focus areas for our industry as we move forward. Within each of those topics, I think we also plan to cover both what we've seen in recent months in terms of reality up until this point as we record this in early July, but also then, of course, what we can expect for the rest of 2023 and pricing as we get into 2024. So without further ado, let's jump right in and let's start with a conversation around volume. What have we been seeing so far in terms of the recovery of volume across the industry? John, does Tripbam have any data that can explain what we've seen so far?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Tripbam tracks what all of our current clients that we had starting back in 2019, and has tracked their volume performance from 2019 to 2023. So we're looking at an apples and apples comparison between the same set of clients in 2019 all the way to 2023. And what we've seen, obviously, the pandemic had a dramatic impact on volumes, everybody knows. But in 2023 specifically, what we've seen is sort of a return to normal, and if normal is 2019. So we're seeing volumes come back, and right now they're hanging at about 80% of the overall volume of 2019, and we track this on a 30-day, basis. And so for every 30-day rolling period from January of 2023 up until right now in July 2023. We've been seeing a little bit of growth, but it's hovering right around 80%. So we're not seeing increasing growth going forward, but just that 80% of the old volume. This does vary tremendously, especially in big cities. There are some cities like San Francisco that are just at 53% of their 2019 volume, or London and Shanghai right around 50% as well. But across an average of all of our clients globally, we're at 80%. And at Tripbam, we're thinking that may be the new norm. There's many predictions by people from Bill Gates to others that there would be a ongoing decrease in overall business transient travel because of the pandemic and the switch to people being more comfortable doing meetings online. And at Tripbam, we're sort of seeing in our data, since the volume levels are plateauing now, that may be the case. Lukasz, I know you have a very global perspective at HRS. What's your point of view on that?
Thank you very much, John. Our perspective is quite similar to what you have just been referring to, except maybe there is a couple of different angles that we're taking into the evaluation of the current situation. So first and foremost, we all agree in terms of 2023, we are now past the mid-year point. The worldwide market average in terms of the volume of business travel is reaching 80%. 80% of where we left it in 2019, right? So this is where we are. But the interesting thing is, you know, aside from the destination perspective that you have kindly brought up, John, there is a vertical perspective that looks extremely interesting that I would like to quote here. So we can definitely see some business verticals moving faster and climbing back faster in terms of volumes than others. Amongst the technology segment is definitely leading, closely followed by industry and construction. These two are definitely in the lead, and both of them are actually very close to hitting 100% of 2019, according to our statistics. There is several other segments like professional services and logistics, also automotive, that are staying below the 80% mark, but their climb trend line is slower, especially when it comes to professional services. So in conclusion, I would say, you know, depending on the vertical, we see a strong average of an 80% comeback in 2023. But if we extrapolate that trend towards 2024, we can see that there are quite several segments that will be reaching the 100% volumes of 2019 by the end of next year.
I think that's an interesting point, Lukasz. I mean, certainly there's some variability across verticals, but I think even across individual companies within those verticals. And I think one of the interesting things to consider is, you know, looking at volume and, you know, like most, I'm getting a bit tired of talking about 2019 as the comparison. But I think, you know, looking across volume per capita is also interesting, right? So, you know, those that are approaching 2019 levels or have even surpassed, any idea if that's driven by a general growth in the organization or in the vertical, or if indeed they are traveling more than they were in 2019?
I reckon they're traveling different, and everybody's traveling different. I would say, you know, this is something probably around, yes, we have to forego the comparisons against 2019, also in terms of patterns, right? Also in terms of the traveler behavior. I think, yes, we have a combination these days of working from anywhere and sort of the more traditional travel that we all remember from the good old days. But I also think we have a lot more volatility. I think we have a lot more flexibility in terms of project teams being moved around, in terms of new offices coming up or being relocated. I think it adds an interesting bit of dynamic to the overall behavior of business travelers and corporations that we definitely have to stay alert to when we think of the context of procurement and when we think of adequately covering for the expectations of today's traveling population.
You both bring up a really interesting point of that understanding where that travel is coming from and how we have to be pretty detailed because it varies so much across organizations and regions. And you look at volume just in the small mid-sized businesses that are coming through, that's seeing some real unexpected growth at our hotels for Marriott International, as much as like 24% And so that's also changed the mix of business at our hotels and the volumes that we're seeing. So it's not just coming from those big global firms, but also those smaller national accounts or smaller business. And then what do those volumes represent at our particular hotels, and really influences that total volume within a market in a region. And like you said, you're looking at it, the levels of industry, we're seeing some similar numbers with the tech and professional services segments in terms of their return to travel and volume. And then even Stephen, with your reference to, we try not to talk about 2019 anymore because it's such a hard number to measure to, because things have changed so much since then, and what is truly the new norm for an account. And that's where that partnership and transparency between a client and their suppliers and their partners to understand what that's going to look like for the moving forward and into 2024 pricing season, even to the particulars of what expectations they're going to have around the world for their own travel, and transparency is going to be critical to that success. John, any other thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I agree with everything you said. We're comparing it to 2019 just so we have a baseline, but travel has changed. And, as I mentioned earlier about the big cities, and Iggy, I know that the footprint of Club Quarters has a lot of properties in those big cities. And so I expect what you're seeing is a little bit different than what Marriott's seeing, which has a much more dispersed footprint. Is that the case?
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's a very good comment. Yeah, we're definitely seeing the data matching some of the numbers that you mentioned, particularly in the area of San Francisco, which is experiencing one of the lowest commercial occupancies currently in the country. And for us, what we're seeing is that direct impact that commercial vacancies have created and how they correlate to travel. So in a city like San Francisco, where the technology vertical is representing a very large population of commercial real estate, and our work in a more hybrid or completely virtual world, I think it has impacted their business travel volumes quite significantly as compared to perhaps market like New York that has more diversity, and we have certainly seen a much larger return of offices in the financial, insurance, and other sectors. London actually had a very quick recovery in terms of return to office, and which is why London for us has led the pack, if you will, in terms of volume returns. It's very interesting how we're all comparing or mentioning 2019 as the benchmark year, but 2019 wasn't a banner year by any stretch of imagination. I think 2020, had COVID not happened, would have surpassed all of the expectations. But I do think that when it comes to measuring where we are off of 2019, it is along the lines of what you mentioned, John, being that most of the major downtown markets are not quite back to 80% just yet.
An interesting piece, we all kind of do our customer surveys and get their voice heard to kind of drive our strategies as we move forward. But majority of our customers that we've heard from, and this is a range of size of organizations, have come back with a factor that they expect year over year increase of their volume, anywhere between 5 to 25% expected for 2024. And that's a real positive indicator for us to hear as organizations, though they might not be back to 2019 levels, but they're still looking at that incremental growth, which it really adds value to the special corporate segment, and a piece that I know for our hotels will definitely take into consideration as they're looking at accounts to target and partner with for 2024.
If I could just add to that, Chris, it's a good point that you've made there about some of the recoveries and how they relate to different types of travel. What we've kind of seen, especially in the mid-sized sector, is a very interesting shift of cities where perhaps a city like Chicago would not have been a major destination for an organization. But because that happens to be a location where they might be conducting meetings in a more effective and cost-effective way than New York, they're no longer traveling maybe in transient volumes as much, but they're traveling in groups. And so we are seeing growth in groups where companies are organizing meetings on a quarterly basis. And when we add those volumes into the big picture, it does come to the 80%, or in some cases, even 100% of where they were in 2019. So I think some companies are traveling more, either at 80% or above 80% of where they were in 2019, but they're just traveling differently. Whether it's projects, in groups, it's not necessarily all coming in transient travel. And we are definitely seeing this growth much more in the small and mid-size sector than we are in some of the what I call the larger Fortune 100 companies, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think Iggy, as a buyer, there's a sort of a pressure coming out of the pandemic years to not lose everything that we learned during those years about exactly, as you mentioned, how to travel differently. There's a lot of recognition that the importance of meeting face to face is very strong. It's a very important thing to do. But we do have tools and technology that allow us to meet virtually on occasion. And I think most programs have found that things are a bit different coming out of the pandemic. Speaking for my organization, we are one of those companies that Chris mentioned do expect our volume to continue to increase toward that full recovery. But to be very transparent, we hope it never gets back to, on a per capita basis, what it was before, in support of our other goals around sustainability and overall business management. So I think it's an interesting dynamic. As we shift gears a little bit, obviously volume and changes in volume play a big role in setting pricing. So as we look ahead to the 2024 sourcing season, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen from a rate evolution perspective so far this year, and certainly what we expect to see in 2024. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think it's on the minds of all of us as we enter into pricing season for 2024. But, even an extension of the volume conversations as we look into the out of the pandemic, the mix of business that has changed within our hotels is incredible. The explosion of leisure and wholesale, the growth and maintenance of meetings and events at our hotels really has influenced where the new norm is for us in terms of where those volumes come and expectations. And with special corporate actually lagging a little bit, it's forced us to look at and evaluate that right mix of business that plays into it. And so I think that's going to have a real major component as we evaluate, small to mid-sized business, the amount of leisure and group business that comes through our hotels, that our owners are going to look at to evaluate what's the right type of business that is right for the hotels. And I think that's where it's going to drive the rates through every market. And it's important for us to look at and evaluate those on a local level. There really isn't a clear universal, hey, this is what you can expect for next year, other than I would expect rate increases to continue through 2024. A lot of that driven in the owner perspective is it's the inflation, labor costs, and things of that sort that are really driving a lot of the costs out of there. And as you saw in 2023, we do see great growth, but that term of real rate growth and ADR growth is really still a concern with our owners to balance the cost of inflation and labor costs as such. In fact, like reported by Star, ADR growth has not kept up with inflation, not just here in the US, but in other major regions around the world. As a quote, like an example, you look at Greater China, our business travel recovery has surpassed 2019 by 8.7%, while rate recovery continues to lag at 8.2. So that kind of local disparity is really where we're trying to balance the two. And it really leads into the conversation is that health of our hospitality industry and taking those considerations of that mix of business, and then how do we use that to determine what our rates are going to be for 2024 and beyond. Iggy, are you seeing anything different on your side for your hotel company?
Thanks, Chris. No, I think we're going through the same exercise and evaluating what that makeup of a hotel base looks like. And it's very different, obviously, market to market. As I mentioned, some markets are doing better than others. One of the key things that we're evaluating is what really defines a corporate account these days, right? Because travel is very different, as we said, and what type of pricing is expected for what I will call a legacy account versus a new account. And those are all the things that we're very closely evaluating. And I think that we'll have a lot of learning moments probably at GBTA as well in our meetings that we're going to have. And, pricing continues to be a very interesting topic, obviously, because we were looking at 2019 as our baseline of where we wanted our pricing to be. And for the most part, we were able to accomplish where we needed to get. There were some exceptions where we had to negotiate maybe a few rounds, but I do expect a lot more stability, hopefully for 2024, as we will have at least 1 year of real post-COVID data that we can look at and stabilize pricing. But I don't think the negotiations will be as microscopic as they were this year. At least I hope not.
Yeah, Iggy, to build upon this is John from Tripbam. Saying that you set your baseline is could you get your corporate negotiated rates back to 2019 levels? From what we see across our 2,000 clients, almost all the hotel chains were pretty much able to do that. What we're seeing is that the booked rate, the corporate booked rate, which would be most of the time their negotiated rate, is averaging $189 for the first 6 months of this year, 2023. And it was $188 in 2019. So $1 difference. So people, even though corporate transient demand is maybe at the 80% level, to all the points Chris made about other segments like leisure picking up the slack, the rates are sort of back to where they were in 2019 at the corporate negotiated level. And even at the market rate level, which Tripbam also tracks, it's averaging $234 at a market rate versus $231 in 2019. So a couple dollars above 2019. And I think that speaks to Chris's point about, there have been other demand segments that have picked up the slack for the corporations only being back at 80%. But overall, what's also interesting is in 2019, the corporations we tracked were on average getting a 19% discount through their negotiated rate program. And in 2023, they're getting a 19% discount off market rates in their corporate negotiated program. So, seems like while on the corporate transit side, we're at 80% on volume, we're back to 100% rate level on the rate side. And to Chris's point around the inflation factors, the cost inflation factors, Tripbam expects there'll be continued push from hotels to catch up with their costs, and therefore, some rate increases for 2024. Lukasz, are you seeing the same thing or having the same opinion and talking to your clients?
Well, yes, definitely. At HRS, our perspective is kind of built out of the experience of working with around about 35% of the Fortune 500 community. So we're talking large corporations and their global footprint. And definitely, I mean, the evolution of rates, I'm seeing double digits. So between 2023 and 24, the expectation is that the global ADR will grow at about 10.4%, and the 12 most successful popular business travel destinations are even going to surpass 12%. And that is a consequence of what Chris and Iggy were expressing earlier on. I mean, at the end of the day, we're dealing with unprecedented rise in operating costs, right? I believe the current ratio is at 55.2%, which is highest in 15 years. That means the actual labor costs per occupied room is 26% higher than 2021. And that, of course, is a serious challenge for anybody who operates hotels, on top of other issues like inflation. So obviously, the strategy of the supply community is also very much influenced by what isn't anymore the leisure surge, but a change of the business mix that had been pretty permanent throughout the recent 12 months. And this is one of the things that makes the procurement season 23-24 a pretty interesting exercise, something definitely to look forward to. Some very interesting conversations about rates and availability. I believe we'll get to that soon in our conversation today.
And just to add to that, if I may, Lukasz, I think there's a factor. There's a factor that we talk about recoveries, and we talk about getting the rate back to 2019 levels. Unfortunately, in the early part of COVID recovery, obviously, business travel volumes were quite low, almost non-existent in some cases, and there were two factors that really helped hotels survive. And survival is a key word that I think is important to stress here. It was rate growth and leisure growth, and without those two things, many hotels would not be open today. And so I think, there's this a precedent now that has been set of the possibility of how much rate could grow in the future. And without the volumes returning to the levels where they were, I think that for many markets, for many hotel companies, rate growth is the way that they remain open. And so I think that's a factor that will continue to come into play.
I think that's an interesting piece, and you hear a lot at Marriott, and we talk about our culture of our associates and our teams, and really comes to, again, that health of the hospitality industry. It's a really important factor for us, and just this investment into our industry, returning to staffing and service levels and traveler experiences, and then our partnerships with our customers through this pandemic has just been incredible. And AHLA puts out some great details on the industry, a little bit more of a US perspective, but they had an interesting piece where they said about every 100 occupied rooms per night supports nearly 250 local jobs. And that's a real meaningful number when you think about what the industry that we represent, and culturally, that focus on the associate and the traveler really brings home driving through that mutual success moving forward, and having those co-partnered strategies of that mutual success. And although the conversations might be hard on some of the rate conversations we have to have, but ultimately, I think our industry is really good about understanding and creating those environments of partnership to grow together. And so they might be tough, but they'll be positive at the end, which is what our industry is great at. Back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, I think in summary, I mean, if we kind of summarize the viewpoints around the table as it relates to pricing for 2024, I think first it's important to remember that this is really sort of in many ways the first normal sourcing exercise that most people will have gone through, those that followed the traditional schedule. If we think back to the sourcing season for rates this year in 2023, remember that we were kind of just in that first year coming out of the pandemic, no real idea around volumes, hadn't fully recovered. Most programs delayed and delayed and delayed, not sure if there was going to be a recession starting earlier this year. So I think, the first key kind of summary point there is just around, this year should be more quote unquote normal compared to what we saw before the pandemic in terms of normal schedules and sort of expectations. But I'm also hearing that generally speaking, we are expecting increasing rate pressure as we look at 2024, though perhaps not quite as strong as in 2023, but definitely there will be a lot of variation there. Important to keep in mind both the macro and the micro perspective of different destinations and different programs as we go. Wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to talk about other priorities, right? The partnership approach, also the contracting approach isn't just about what the price is for the room. Lukasz, I know you guys are doing a lot of work around other priorities. What else is important to buyers as we start to look at pricing and partnership for 2024?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm glad you're bringing this up because yes, in our approach and in our world, the conversation goes way beyond the discussion on price. It's all about strategic priorities and the overall value that we can build between the expectations of those large corporates and the community of relevant supply. So what we've been seeing at HRS is a really interesting trend that is looking into some of those priorities in line with the changes that we observe in the market. So, for instance, when we talk about corporate cost avoidance, and this used to be boiled down to a topic of hard savings in the past, we definitely see a lot more creativity around that topic in terms of looking into the details of availability. So at what levels is my preferred portfolio available on average? And what decisions will be driven from that based on, again, insufficient availabilities or availabilities that have been impacted by the other segments that have been booming over the course of the recent months. So availability as a indirect discussion on the savings objectives. And another one that is definitely here to stay is also the ideas coming from the corporate community on how to best make use of convergence strategy. So basically narrowing down the pool of relevant suppliers, but in exchange, pushing all of the combinations of various different segments, from transients to meetings and groups to long stay, to those preferred suppliers who are capable of dealing with that on a regular basis. So it's basically consolidation towards a more relevant, narrowed down community of supply. Part of that discussion is also reaching into not just what we want to accomplish, but how do we react to the changes in the market? How do we react to the demand patterns and all kinds of challenges related to availability as well? And I think a big topic point on many of the corporate buyers' agenda is how to treat best the approach to dynamic program management. How to best make use of it, how to be able to anticipate some of those trends in advance and still be able to have a reliable forecast around them, right? So not really dive and embrace into a fully dynamic program, but for the destinations where the buying power isn't as it used to be, make smart choices around participation in the dynamic offerings. That also enables more agile decision making when it comes to, again, changing demand patterns. Right? We have spoken about that there is more movement going on, that there is more unpredictability in terms of corporate patterns aside from the top historically preferred destinations, and utilizing a dynamic program is definitely a way to stay on top of this. Stephen, you were making references earlier on to the impact of prioritizing sustainability, and I think there's been a lot of noise that's coming out of Europe on the back of the CSRD directive, so corporate sustainability reporting directive, that has been launched and embraced by the EU, with consequences to a lot of international businesses. Anybody who holds an office of a certain size in Europe will definitely be impacted by this. Highly recommended read for anybody involved in procurement, since yes, it's a pretty radical approach to how the largest corporations of the world will have to comply with expectations for reporting details on sustainability. So by default, it is becoming one of the leading priorities to a lot of buyers, to a lot of purchasing organizations of the largest corporations. I would say, last but not least, from the community of topics that relate to rising priorities on the buying side, definitely a lot more focus to boil down the criteria of traveler satisfaction. This just like savings used to be a one-liner in the past, and I think, again, with the evolving expectations of the corporation, we are going far deeper now in terms of defining what satisfaction really means. Is it your smooth check-in, check-out process? Is it your on-stay experience? Is it the fact that your virtual credit card payment worked on property level? So definitely a lot more preparation, a lot more depth in terms of how we prepare and how we evaluate expectations and priorities for the procurement season of this year. What do you guys think? What have you seen on your side?
Yeah, I agree, Lukasz. I think there's a lot of balancing required for a buyer in today's world. If we think about price being one key element, and knowing that that's going to be an area of pressure, at least that's sort of what we summarized a bit earlier in our conversation. It becomes a little bit a question of how to pull and focus on those other levers. A few things you mentioned around availability is definitely a key thing to focus in on. But I think really the important trend is that, unlike years of the past, it's really not a set it and forget it kind of exercise anymore. There's certainly a bulk of the work that will be done during the traditional season, but to make sure that you're continuing to monitor, to look at your actual data, to look at opportunities on a more frequent basis is really going to be key. And I think that leads really well into sort of wrapping up, as we're sadly running out of time. But just wanted to go really quickly around the table and sort of in 90 seconds, maybe wrap up with one key takeaway or one key thought. And Iggy, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Stephen. It's always best to go first, I guess, right? I'll build my key takeaway into a point that you just made, because I think it's really important that in these different times, we take a different approach to hotel accommodations when it comes to sourcing, pricing, or anything involved in supplier-buyer relations. And I think one of the key things we have to focus on is not to wait until the normal cycle to have conversation around relationships and pricing and whatever is involved. And Lukasz knows me very well, and he knows I'm a big fan of continuous sourcing. And I think that in these very unique times, there are opportunities for buyers and suppliers to improve their relationships in many ways, whether it's pricing, satisfaction, market share, share shift, whatever you want to call it. And so I think that it requires a lot more touch points than perhaps we have done this year, as we've all have been just trying to set our priorities for this year and managing with very low resources and managing very turbulent times. But as we look out to the future in 2024, I think that we have to look at something like continuous sourcing and like travel buyer supplier relations to require a lot more touch points and to be a lot more fluid than just waiting for that traditional cycle to come.
Thanks, Iggy. John, final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to echo Lukasz and Iggy on that, and you, Stephen, that, while like many of you, we expect this to be a much calmer RFP season than last year's when everybody was still getting back into the swing of things. Travel patterns are still changing, and with leisure and groups being a bigger part of the demand, it creates swings in availability, as both Lukasz and Iggy have mentioned. And because of that, Stephen, to your point, I'm going to echo, I think not only continuous sourcing, but continuous monitoring comes before the continuous sourcing. And so, I think it's important that that travel managers are, every month looking at how their destination mix and the volume at their destinations are changing and how the availability at their preferred properties are changing, and then making adjustments accordingly. Obviously most people know that Tripbam is a reshop house. And so we're always tracking how often rates are fluctuating. And in today's environment, we're still seeing, that rates are fluctuating at 18 to 20% from when a traveler books their rate to when they might check in. And so it's because of, the leisure demand and the meetings demand and everything creating these fluctuations, along with corporate travel patterns changing, which I think makes continuous monitoring of how are your rates performing, which destinations are you delivering volume to, and then making the adjustments through continuous sourcing. I'm going to echo all those previous points. So Chris, I guess I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think you guys are hitting the main points. And I mentioned it earlier, is this, partner for mutual success, and just that openness of the value of that partnerships, the transparency between us, right? And being open to unique in all opportunities that we go through, right? So leaning into the partnerships, sharing the goals, collaborating to achieve those mutual goals together. Transparency, even to the level of sharing what your travel forecast, even if you're not sure what it's going to be, that can lead that conversation into understanding and sustaining what your needs are going to be and how we can partner with you to bring a solution to give you your coverage that's there. And I think that really speaks to the flexibility you need in exploring other options, right? That, like Lukasz said, the dynamic or NLRA options that are out there, where maybe it's on the dynamic model because you're not sure where your travel is going to go. So maybe a more flexible environment in a dynamic environment provides that availability, maybe in compressed markets, maybe to have hotels interested in participating in a program. Or just finding that inventory. So really trying to figure out what's that right mix there. And even also to ease your burden, to know you have the coverage, but then maybe concentrate on those really top markets where a static volume producer rate plays. And then even on the hotel perspective, an NLRA rate might be a little bit more attractive in a compressed market, or for a hotel where you want to find that availability to play. So just that emphasis on the value of our partnerships, the transparency between us, and sharing and being open to creative ideas. Stephen, back to you.
Perfect. Last but not least, Lukasz, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Thank you, Stephen. Definitely, the most sort of simple words that come to mind would be, yeah, let's all forget. That's my appeal. Let's all forget about those comparisons against the, what the pre-pandemic world used to be like. I think, we have so much dynamic change around us, coming from both the community of customers and supply, that those changes always mean opportunity. They just need to be interpreted and understood the right way. So yes, we need more dialogue. We need more mutual education. And I would say, the key to success here is let's not just stick to understanding and fulfilling customer needs. Let's also try to understand the way that the entire ecosystem works, the way that it ticks these days, and the opportunities within. They are very different opportunities to what we have been dealing with in the past. So bright future ahead for those who are willing to step up the game. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lukasz. And thank you all for your participation today. We've had a really great collaborative and dynamic discussion, and it's certainly appreciated. To our listeners, for those who are attending the upcoming GBTA convention, make sure to attend the Accommodation Committee's education session regarding the 2024 sourcing season, which will be a continuation and continue to build on our conversation today. Once again, thank you to our panelists. And to our listeners, you've been listening to The Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. For more information about GBTA and its important work, visit gbta.org and be sure to rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks for listening.